The lantern on the kitchen table was burning low, a single flickering eye in the vast, dark prairie. Thomas Hale sat hunched over it, the silence of his home pressing in from all sides. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, the kind that follows a man after he's lost everything. He'd lived with it for years, thought he'd made his peace with it. But some nights, like tonight, it felt like a physical weight trying to crush him. He was just about to blow out the flame and surrender to the dark when a sound cut through the stillness. A knock. It wasn't a friendly knock, not a neighbor stopping by. This was soft at first, then urgent. Desperate, Thomas's chair scraped against the floorboards as he shot to his feet. In this part of the country, a knock after midnight meant one thing: trouble. He grabbed the rifle from its hooks by the door, his heart pounding a slow, heavy drumbeat against his ribs. He cracked the door open just enough to see. Two small figures stood on his porch, bathed in the pale, ghostly light of the moon. The taller one, a girl maybe 5 years old, was holding a little boy wrapped in a bundle on her hip. Their feet were black with dirt. Their clothes were little more than rags. The girl's hair was a mess, stuck to her tear-streaked cheeks. Her voice, when she spoke, was the sound of a dry twig snapping. "Sir," she whispered, "Mama never came back. She said they waited all night by the window of their little house, but their mama was gone. They didn't know where else to go." For a long moment, Thomas couldn't move, couldn't speak. He just stared. The little boy in her arms let out a soft, hiccuping cry, and the girl instinctively hitched him higher on her hip. It was a practiced, motherly movement that looked all wrong on a frame so small. "Come in," Thomas finally managed to say, his voice thick with sleep and disuse. He opened the door wider. The girl hesitated for just a second, her eyes darting past him into the empty moonlit yard, as if still hoping to see a familiar figure riding toward them. Then she stepped inside. The lantern light hit their faces, and the house suddenly felt way too bright. It showed the grime, the tear tracks, and something else. A small dark purple bruise, shaped like fingers, wrapped around the girl's tiny wrist. Thomas's breath caught in his chest. His blood ran cold. This wasn't just a story about a lost mother. This was something darker. Something had happened to these children. He knelt down slowly, trying not to spook them. "Sit by the fire," he said, his voice softer now. "I'll get you something to eat." He cut thick slices of bread and poured milk, his hands moving on their own while his mind raced. Who would do that to a child? The girl, whose name he learned was May, wouldn't touch her food until he gave her a nod. Then she carefully broke her bread into tiny pieces, dipping them in milk and feeding them to her little brother, Eli. She only ate the soggy crumbs that were left over. "Where's your place?" Thomas asked, trying to keep his voice steady. May pointed a trembling, milk-wet hand toward the east. "By the creek, the little house with the red curtains." She said her mama told them not to open the door for anyone, but she never came back. And Eli got so hungry. Thomas stared into the fire, his jaw clenched tight. He knew the land east of the creek. It was worthless scrub, forgotten by God and man. He'd passed a dilapidated shack out that way 100 times, a place that was more lean-to than house. And he knew for a fact it had no curtains, red or any other color. The little girl was lying, or she was repeating a lie she'd been told. But why? What was she trying to hide? After they ate, sleep started to pull at them. May fought it, her little head nodding and then jerking back up, as if she was afraid of what would happen if she closed her eyes. Thomas laid a quilt by the fire, and she gently put Eli down, curling around him like a human shield. Thomas sat in his chair and watched them, the rifle now resting against the wall. The silence returned to the house, but it was different now. It was filled with the sound of two small children breathing. He didn't know what he was supposed to do. He was a man who knew cattle and fences, not children. He reached for the old Bible on the mantel, a book he hadn't touched in years. It fell open to a verse he hadn't read in a long time. "Suffer the little children to come unto me." He closed the book. It wasn't that simple. He stared at the sleeping kids until the fire was just glowing embers. He watched the way May's small, bruised arm was draped protectively over her brother, a silent promise to keep him safe. He stood up and went to the window, staring out at the empty prairie, half expecting to see someone riding toward the house. But there was nothing, just the wind and the dark. "Lord," he whispered to the empty room, "why did you send them to me?" From the rug by the fire, May stirred in her sleep. Her voice was a tiny, heartbreaking whisper that cut right through him. "Will Mama know where to find us?" Thomas didn't have an answer. He couldn't give her one. He just stood there, a long shadow in the dark, feeling the weight of a question that had no easy answer. He had a terrible feeling that their mama wasn't coming back at all, and that whoever had left that mark on May's wrist was still out there somewhere, under the same wide, empty sky. Morning came, and with it a decision. Thomas knew he couldn't keep them here. It wasn't right. He wasn't equipped for it. The proper thing to do was to take them to town, to the authorities, let someone else handle it. He cooked them breakfast, his movements stiff and deliberate. May watched him from the floor, her eyes wide and uncertain, clutching Eli like he was her only anchor in the world. "We're going to town," he told her after they ate. "Need supplies." It was a lie, and he felt the shame of it in his gut. But how do you tell a 5-year-old girl you're taking her to an orphanage? Her small hand tightened on the bench. "Mama said not to leave the house," she whispered. "Mama ain't here," Thomas said, his voice gentler than he felt. He hated the fear in her eyes, the way she looked at him as if he were about to break her world all over again. The ride into town was quiet and tense. May sat straight-backed on the wagon seat, holding Eli, humming a tune that sounded more like a prayer. When they arrived, heads turned. Thomas Hale was a solitary man. Seeing him with 2 small, ragged children was a spectacle. Inside the mercantile, Mrs. Brandt, the owner, nearly dropped her ledger. "Mercy, Thomas, whose children are these?" "Found 'em at my door," he said, avoiding her gaze as he grabbed a sack of flour he didn't need. "Their mama's gone." That was all it took. The whispers started instantly. 2 other women in the store moved closer, their eyes full of pity and morbid curiosity. "That's Annie's kids, I'd wager. Poor things, that woman was always wild. Heard she ran off with a gambler from up north." May stood frozen, her face turned down, trying to make herself invisible. Thomas saw the red flush creep up her neck, and a hot, protective anger flared in his chest. He paid for his things and guided the children out, but the whispers followed them. As he was about to leave, he saw a man standing across the street, leaning against a post, watching them. A hard-faced stranger with cold, calculating eyes. The man didn't look away. He just stared, then deliberately spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust and turned, melting back into the alleyway. A shiver went down Thomas's spine. It felt like a warning. Before he could process it, the town preacher, Reverend Coulter, approached him. The preacher looked from the children back to Thomas, his old eyes full of a wisdom Thomas didn't possess. "The Lord's work is not always easy, son," he said quietly, "but it is always right." The words didn't offer much comfort. On the ride back, the sky grew dark, threatening rain. As their small ranch came into view, May finally broke the silence. "Are you taking us to the orphan place?" she asked, her voice so small he almost didn't hear it. Thomas's hands tightened on the reins. He couldn't lie to her again. He just looked at her. She shook her head, her eyes pleading. "They lock the doors at night, Mama told me." He didn't answer, but something inside him hardened. The thought of these 2, locked in a dark room, alone. He couldn't do it. When they got back, he didn't unpack the supplies. He went straight to the barn, his mind made up. He wasn't taking them anywhere. Not yet. They would stay. That night, a storm rolled in, shaking the small house. With every crash of thunder, May flinched, pulling Eli closer. "Storms break houses," she whispered, her body trembling. "Not this one," Thomas said, kneeling beside her. "Not this house." He stayed with them by the fire until the storm passed, until their breathing evened out into the rhythm of sleep. He stood in the doorway of the small room where he'd made them a bed, watching them. He saw May's hand, the one without the bruise, stretched out as if reaching for someone in her sleep. He quietly closed the door. He felt it then, a shift in the air, a feeling of being watched. He went to the window and peered out into the rain-swept darkness. For a moment, he thought he saw it. A figure standing out by the fence line, just a dark shape against the dark land. a man watching the house. Then a flash of lightning lit up the sky, and there was nothing there. Was it the stranger from town? Was it his imagination? Or was the trouble he'd invited in that first night just now beginning to show its face? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the rain beat a relentless rhythm on the roof of the house that was no longer just his. The days that followed fell into a strange new rhythm. Thomas found himself learning the language of children, the meaning of a certain cry from Eli, the quiet sadness that sometimes clouded May's eyes. She started to follow him around the ranch like a small shadow, her initial fear slowly being replaced by a fragile trust. She helped him feed the chickens, her face serious with concentration. He even heard her laugh once, a small, surprising sound that felt like sunshine breaking through clouds. He started to fix things around the house he'd let go for years. A broken latch, a squeaky floorboard. It felt good to be building something again, even if he didn't know what it was. But the world outside his fence line wasn't so easily mended. The whispers from town grew louder, carried on the wind. They weren't just about a runaway mother anymore. Now they were about him, a lonely man, keeping two strange children. What were his intentions? Mrs. Hargreave, a widow with a tongue as sharp as a new knife, stopped him after church service. "Mr. Hale," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes, "there are proper places for children like that. You shouldn't burden yourself." "Proper ain't always kind, Mrs. Hargreave," Thomas replied, his voice flat and hard. He walked away before she could say more, but he felt May stiffen beside him. She was listening to every word, gauging his every reaction, trying to figure out if this place, this man, was truly safe. To show her he meant it, he spent the afternoon teaching her how to be gentle with his old horse, how to speak softly to it so it would trust her. For a little while, watching her whisper secrets into the horse's ear, she just looked like a little girl, the shadows in her eyes momentarily forgotten. But the shadows always returned. One evening, as he sat on the porch sharpening a knife, a rider appeared on the road, moving slow and deliberate toward the ranch. It wasn't a neighbor. Thomas felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He sent May and Eli inside and stood up, the knife still in his hand as the rider dismounted at his gate. It was the stranger from town, the man with the cold eyes. "You Hale?" the man asked, his voice like gravel grinding together. Thomas just nodded. "Name's Reddick," the man said, spitting into the dirt. "I come about that shack east of the creek." Thomas's grip tightened on the knife. Reddick's eyes flickered toward the house, where May was peeking through the curtain. "That place belonged to my sister Annie," Reddick said, "and last I heard, she had 2 kids. Guess that makes them mine to claim." "Your sister?" Thomas's mind reeled. The town gossip said Annie ran off with a gambler. Was this him? Or was this something else entirely? "They showed up on my step half-starved," Thomas said, his voice dangerously low. "You didn't seem too concerned about 'em then." "Didn't know where they were," Reddick sneered. "But I know now, and the law says blood comes first. I'll be taking them. And the land." At that moment, May, small and trembling, stepped out onto the porch. "Mama said we'd be safe here," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but defiant. Reddick looked down at her, and a cruel, nasty smile twisted his lips. "Mama said a lot of things, girl, but Mama ain't here now, is she?" He looked directly at her wrist, the one Thomas knew was bruised under her sleeve. May instinctively pulled her arm back, her face draining of all color. And Thomas knew. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone. This man wasn't her uncle, he was her nightmare, he was the reason for the bruise, he was the reason her mother was gone. "You need to leave," Thomas said, stepping between Reddick and the porch. Reddick laughed, a short, ugly sound. "This ain't over, old man. I'll be back. And I'll have papers from the county judge. You can't keep what's mine." He mounted his horse and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a thick, suffocating dread hanging in the air. Thomas turned and looked at May. Her face was pale, her eyes huge and terrified. She wasn't just afraid of leaving, she was terrified of the man she was supposed to go with. That night, Thomas didn't sleep. He paced the kitchen floor, the threat of Reddick's return hanging over them. He now understood the fear in this little girl's eyes. It wasn't just about an orphanage. She and Eli were running from that man, and their mother. Their mother had been trying to get them away from him. Had she succeeded only to fail herself? He had no proof, just a gut feeling and the look in a child's eyes. But it was enough. He would not let that man take them. He didn't know how he was going to stop him, but as he looked at May, huddled by the dying fire, he made a silent vow. He would stand between them and the darkness Reddick represented, no matter the cost. He was no longer just a man in a quiet house. He was a guardian, and his watch had just begun. Reddick's threat echoed in the quiet corners of the house. Thomas knew the man wasn't bluffing. In this land, blood right was a powerful claim, and the law often sided with it, no questions asked. He had to find a way to fight it. He had to find something stronger than blood. The answer, he realized, was in the girl's own words. The lie she had told him that first night. "May," he said gently the next morning, kneeling in front of her, "tell me about the red curtains." Her face immediately closed off. She shook her head, looking at the floor. "Mama said not to." "Sometimes," Thomas said, his voice low and steady, "we have to tell secrets to stay safe. Is this one of those times?" She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. He saw the war inside her, the promise she'd made to her mother versus the terrifying reality of Reddick. Finally, she nodded, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. "It wasn't curtains," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It was a box. A red tin box. Mama hid it. She said it was our ticket away. She said to remember the red, and if anything happened, to tell someone we could trust." A red tin box. A ticket away. It was a long shot, a child's cryptic memory, but it was all he had. After settling the children with a promise to be back before dark, Thomas saddled his horse and rode east, toward the dilapidated shack by the creek. The place was even worse up close. The roof sagged, the door hung on one hinge. It smelled of rot and despair. Inside was a single room, empty save for dust and cobwebs. He searched everywhere, his hope fading with every barren corner he checked. There was nothing. He was about to give up when her words came back to him. Mama hid it. He started tapping on the floorboards. Most were rotten, but one, near the cold, dead hearth, sounded different. Solid. He pried at it with his knife, the wood groaning in protest. It finally came loose, and there, nestled in the dark earth beneath, was a small red tin box, just as she'd said. His hands trembled as he opened it. It wasn't filled with money, it was filled with papers, folded and worn, but legible. The first was a deed. Not to this worthless patch of scrubland, but to a small, promising gold claim in the northern hills. But it wasn't the deed that made his blood run cold. It was the name on it. It wasn't Annie's. It was registered to a man named Jacob Vance. Beneath the deed was a letter, written in a hurried, frantic hand. It was from Annie. "If you are reading this, I am gone. The man calling himself Reddick is not my brother. His name is Cole. He was my husband's partner. They found the gold together, but Cole got greedy. He killed Jacob and buried him out on the claim. He forced me to go along, threatened my children if I didn't. He has the law in his pocket in the north, but not here. I took the deed, the only proof, and ran. I was going to sell it, get my children somewhere safe where he could never find us. He's a monster. He hurt my May. He will not stop until he has the deed and silences anyone who knows the truth. Do not let him have my children." Thomas stared at the letter, the words blurring. This was so much worse than he could have imagined. Reddick, or Cole, wasn't just a cruel opportunist. He was a killer. And May and Eli weren't just abandoned children. They were witnesses. The only thing standing between a murderer and a fortune. He finally understood. Reddick didn't want the children out of family duty. He wanted them because they were a loose end. He wanted the land because he thought the box was hidden there. And his threat to come back with papers wasn't about custody. It was a promise to finish what he started. A cold, hard fury settled over Thomas. This was no longer about sheltering orphans. This was about justice. He put the papers carefully inside his coat, replaced the floorboard, and rode back to the ranch as fast as his horse could carry him. The setting sun cast long, ominous shadows across the prairie, and Thomas felt like he was in a race against the night. When he got back, he found May on the porch, watching the road, her small face tight with anxiety. He knelt in front of her, taking her small hands in his. "I found the box, May," he said softly. "I know everything. You don't have to be scared anymore. I'm not going to let him hurt you." For the first time since she'd arrived, the tension in her small body seemed to release. Tears streamed down her face, but they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of relief. But Thomas knew this was far from over. Reddick would be back. Not with a county judge, but with a gun. He would come to take the box and eliminate the last two people who could connect him to his crime. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into darkness. The house, once a quiet sanctuary, now felt like a fort under siege. And the battle was coming. Night fell like a shroud. Thomas didn't bother lighting the main lantern, keeping the house as dark as possible. He barred the door, checked the load in his rifle, and sat in a chair where he could see both the front door and the window. He'd told May to take Eli into the small back room and stay quiet, no matter what she heard. The prairie outside was unnaturally still. The wind had died down, and even the crickets were silent, as if the whole world were holding its breath. Thomas's senses were on fire. Every creak of the old house sounded like a footstep. Every shadow seemed to move. He didn't have to wait long. The faint, rhythmic sound of approaching horses reached him first. It wasn't one rider. It was several. Thomas moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. 3 figures emerged from the darkness, their forms silhouetted against the faint starlight. Reddick was in the lead. The other 2 were hired guns, their rifles held ready. They stopped just outside the yard. "Hale," Reddick's voice cut through the night. "I know you're in there. I know you found the box. You've got no place in this. Give me the deed and the girl, and I'll let you live." Thomas's knuckles were white on the stock of his rifle. The girl, he wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. "You're not taking them," Thomas yelled back, his voice steady, betraying none of the fear coiling in his stomach. A shot rang out, and a bullet splintered the wood of the doorframe inches from his head. They weren't here to talk. "Wrong answer, old man," Reddick shouted. Thomas dropped to one knee, raising his rifle to the window. He was a rancher, not a gunman. 1 man against 3. The odds were impossible. He could hear a small, terrified whimper from the back room, and his heart clenched. He had to protect them. Another shot slammed into the house. He knew they were just waiting for him to show himself. They would pin him down, then storm the house. It was over. He'd failed. Then, through the ringing in his ears, he heard another sound. It was the rumbling of a wagon, coming fast, and the jingle of harnesses. He saw the bobbing glow of lanterns cutting through the darkness from the direction of the town road. For a wild second, he thought it was the sheriff. But it wasn't. The wagon slid to a halt at the edge of his property. Stepping down, holding a lantern high, was the old preacher, Reverend Coulter. And behind him, spilling out of the wagon and emerging from the darkness on foot, were the people from the town. Mrs. Brant from the mercantile, the big blacksmith holding a heavy hammer, a dozen other ranchers and farmhands. They weren't carrying guns, but they were there, standing together, a silent, unmovable wall of ordinary people who had decided that enough was enough. Reddick and his men turned, stunned by the sudden appearance of the crowd. "Evening, Reddick," the preacher's voice boomed across the yard, calm and resolute. "Seems you found some trouble out here. We're here to see it resolved peacefully." Reddick's face, illuminated in the lantern light, was a mask of pure fury. He was trapped. "This ain't your business, preacher. This is between me and him." "When you threaten children in our valley," the blacksmith said, his voice a low growl, "it becomes everyone's business." Seeing his plan collapsing, Reddick became desperate. He let out a yell and spurred his horse directly at the house, raising his pistol to fire through the window. It was a mad final charge, but he never made it. Thomas fired his rifle, not at Reddick, but into the air. The loud crack startled the horse, which reared up, throwing Reddick to the ground. Before he could recover, the blacksmith and 2 other men were on him, wresting the gun from his hand and pinning him in the dirt. His 2 hired guns, seeing the fight was lost, turned their horses and fled into the night. It was over. The yard was suddenly quiet again, the only sounds the heavy breathing of the men holding Reddick down and the soft sobs coming from inside the house. Thomas unbarred the door and stepped out onto the porch. The townsfolk looked at him, their faces grim but determined. The preacher walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You didn't think we'd let you face this alone, did you, son?" Thomas couldn't speak. He just nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He went back inside. May was huddled in the corner of the main room, her arms wrapped tightly around a crying Eli. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and shining in the dim light. "He's gone," Thomas said softly. "For good?" she whispered. He knelt down in front of her, the weight of the last few days finally settling on him. "For good," he confirmed. "You don't have to wait by any window anymore. You're home." The words broke something inside her, a dam of fear and grief she'd been holding back for so long. She launched herself into his arms, burying her face in his shirt, and for the first time she cried. Not quiet, fearful tears, but loud, wrenching sobs of a child who could finally let go. Thomas held her tight, his own eyes burning, while Eli reached out and placed a small, trusting hand on his arm. Outside, the town held a killer. Inside, a family was being born from the ashes of fear and violence. The prairie night was no longer empty and silent. It was filled with the sounds of justice and the quiet promise of a new dawn. The county sheriff arrived an hour later, not to question Thomas, but to take Reddick, Cole, away in irons. The letter from Annie, combined with the testimony of a brave little girl who no longer had to hide, was more than enough. The truth of what happened to Jacob Vance on that gold claim would finally come out. The townsfolk eventually departed, leaving with quiet nods and hands clasped in solidarity. The house settled back into a new kind of quiet, a peaceful quiet. The children, exhausted, fell asleep on the quilt by the fire, their small bodies tangled together. Thomas stood at the window for a long time, watching the sun begin to edge its way over the horizon. The prairie, which had once seemed so vast and empty, now felt like a promise. He picked up the deed to the gold claim. It was their inheritance, their future. But their home was here. He went to his old deed box, the one containing the papers to his ranch, the only thing he had left of his old life. He took out a pen and, in his neatest script, added 2 new names alongside his own: May and Eli Hale. He slid the box onto a shelf, a silent testament to the new foundation he was laying. In the weeks that followed, the house came alive. Laughter echoed in the yard. The wind chime he'd hung on the porch now seemed to play a cheerful tune. May, with the shadows finally chased from her eyes, was learning to read, her small finger tracing the words in an old primer. Eli toddled after her, his chubby hands always into some kind of mischief. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, Thomas sat on the porch step, watching them. May was patiently showing Eli how the fireflies she'd caught in a jar blinked on and off. It wasn't a grand estate or a storybook ending. It was just this: a weathered porch, a simple meal cooling on the stove, and the quiet, contented sighs of 2 children who had found their safe harbor. And Thomas knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that this was how a family was truly made. Not by blood, but by choice. Not by chance, but by courage. One small act of kindness at a time. Which city are you watching our video from? Please let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content that will stay with you. Thank you for watching.